And this is the first of this year's IT Learning Centre summer talks. So it's great to kind of kick that season off with a bang. So we're very happy to welcome today's visiting speaker from the world of AI and machine learning. So Professor John Schock, hello to you, from the University of Cape Town's Maths Department, and also the INRS in Montreal. So John's research interests have included neuroscience, a bit of string theory, and suddenly topical machine learning. So, quite a range there. But he's going to talk to us today about the world of modern AI. We're really hoping for a little insight into kind of this powerful technology. If I may, just at this point, do a little plug, because John will be with us again on the 17th, so next Wednesday is that, with his other talk in this series. So Oxford people, do book your place on that one too. So as you may have heard us saying earlier, he's happy for us to ask questions as we go along, which is great. So if you've got a question or a comment, you can turn your microphone on, just politely say hello, and John will happily sort of pick that question then. If that doesn't work for you, and you or you prefer not to, and you want to write it in the chat, then between us we'll keep an eye on the things that appear in the chat. But forgive us if that doesn't get picked up sort of immediately. We will aim to have a look at those comments towards the end. So yeah, despite all the globe hopping in his career, John's roots do go back to Oxford. So I just hope, folks, that you'll make him very welcome. So over to you, John. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk here. I wish, as always, with these things that it could be live and I could be there, but in this day and age, this will have to do. So welcome everybody. So I'm going to give a what's called a lightning tour of AI, and I thought about over the last few weeks exactly how I wanted to do this. Whether I just wanted to dive straight into the modern aspects of AI, or perhaps build a little bit from the ground up. And I've taken the second route here. So the first sort of 2/3 or so of the talk are really the origins of modern machine learning, actually going back a fairly long way. So we're going to go back well over 100 years to begin with, to find out exactly how it was that we got to where we are today. And then in the last third or so, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the current state of modern machine learning, what's happened over the last couple of years, and where this might be going. As was said before, please do ask any questions as we go along. Let's see. So the first thing that I want to really question is, why is this important? And we find ourselves at a really interesting kind of juncture, I think, in humanity, where we have a tool available to us, and many of you have seen it, not everybody, but the likes of ChatGPT have come along over the last year, and a number of other technologies which have come out of artificial intelligence, and they give us really, really incredible potential for what we may be able to do with these tools. And I'll talk about some of those potentials later, but also massive potential risks. And I think that it's really important that as citizens, we understand as much as possible, what's going on behind the scenes and what the potential futures may be, so that we can make informed decisions. There's an extremely good book by Brian Christian called The Alignment Problem, which really gives a lot of the background to this, and some of the modern uses of machine learning. Of course, one of the problems is that machine learning has come along such a long way in the last year or two, that anything that's been published, more than a year or two ago is in some sense out of date. And I'll talk a little bit later about kind of some of the uncertainties that we're facing at the moment. So I thought about where we should start with this, and there's lots of different places we could start. We could go all the way back to the Jacquard loom, which was essentially in some sense, the precursor to the punch card programming languages that were around in the first half and part of the second half of the 20th century. People like Ada Lovelace, who in some sense was the first computer programmer, even before the computer as we know it today was around, but who understood how one would think about programming a computer. Alan Turing, Gene Samet, who came up with one of the programming languages which is most used today. Geoffrey Hinton, one of the pioneers of modern AI, and of course OpenAI. So where do we start with this? Well, I'm actually going to start in the 19th century, end of the 19th century, with this researcher, Santiago Ramón y Cajal, who did these beautiful drawings based on microscope viewings of neurons. Okay? He did lots of different types of neurons. We discovered that there were many different structures in the brain, and he did these extremely detailed microscopic drawings of the structures of neurons. Okay. And just diving into this a little bit, we're going to be talking about neural networks later, but most of what I'm going to be talking about is about artificial neural networks. But to some extent, this has been sort of motivated by real networks of neurons in the brain. And this is just a cartoon, of course, but here we have two neurons. I don't know, actually, I can't see my mouse. Nope. Okay. So we have two neurons here. Actually, let me see if there's any way that I can view the mouse. No, apparently not. Okay.
John,
we have two neurons in there. Oh, you can see the mouse.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
I can't. Okay. Okay. I don't seem to be able to, but don't worry about it.
No.
Okay, we have two neurons here connected at what you see in the middle area is the synapse. And essentially the neuron is simply it's a biological cell which sends a signal. There are inputs that come from one neuron and connect via the synapses into the dendrites of another neuron. And the potential, the voltage changes in the region around the nucleus of the neuron until it reaches some threshold, at which point an electrical signal is sent down the axon of the neuron and goes into the next neurons. Okay, so through the dendrites into the next neuron. And essentially what happens is you have a signal which is kind of like a 0 or a 1. Either the neuron is firing or it's not firing. And this is called an action potential, is the firing of the signal in the electrochemical process, which goes down the axon of the neuron and then into the next one. And the next one will fire if enough neurons fire as they're going into it, simplifying things a lot in terms of excitatory and inhibitory neurons. But essentially, this is what's happening with the neuron. It's just sort of binary that either it fires or it doesn't. We jump forward a little bit again to around the early 20th century, and Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead are two mathematicians, logicians, philosophers, who write this incredible tome called the Principia Mathematica. And what they're attempting to do here is to build mathematics from the ground up, really from the most basic building blocks of logic, very, very, very basic axiomatic ideas of mathematics. How do you build up to more complex mathematics? So that's really the question they're asking. And they do this in 3 volumes in this book, the Principia Mathematica, over around 1,000 pages. And it takes them up to a little under 400 pages, I believe, to get to this this bottom piece you see on the screen, where they say at the bottom, from this proposition, it will follow when arithmetical addition has been defined, that 1 + 1 = 2. It takes them almost 400 pages to prove that 1 + 1 = 2. This is no simple feat, but what they're doing is putting mathematics on a really, really firm foundation. We jump ahead again to 1935, and this guy Walter Pitts. And Walter Pitts is being chased by a gang in Detroit, and he ducks into a library. They're closing up in the library, and he hides out. And during the night, he comes across this book, and the book happens to be the Principia Mathematica, and he gets kind of drawn into it. And he spends the next 3 days in the library just devouring this book. This, incredible 1,000-page tome on complex mathematics, and he loves it. A thrilling storyline, brilliantly told. Most people would just find this unbelievably dry and difficult to follow, but he makes it through. And he writes to Bertrand Russell afterwards and says, I really enjoyed your book. There were a couple of things that I wasn't so sure about in it, maybe a couple of mistakes. And Bertrand Russell writes back and says, wow, thank you for the great review. And yes, I see what you're talking about here. Would you like to come and be my graduate student? There's a problem because in 1935, Walter Pitts is 12 years old. And so going to be a graduate student with Bertrand Russell is not easy. In fact, Walter Pitts comes from a pretty broken home. He runs away from home a little while after this, and never sees his family again. But he's this sort of absolute savant who, at the age of 12, is able to digest and synthesize the knowledge of this, incredibly complex book. He meets Jerome Letvin at a talk actually given by Bertrand Russell a few years later, and they become very, very good friends. Jerome Letvin is very different from Walter Pitts. Whereas Pitts is sort of interested in logic and mathematics, Letvin is interested in music and art and life in general. And in fact, he goes into medicine, into biological research. And his supervisor is this guy on the right, Warren McCulloch. Warren McCulloch invites Letvin and Walter Pitts, who around this time is, I think, 17 or 18 years old, to come and live with them, with him and his wife, Warren McCulloch and his wife. And McCulloch and Pitts become good friends and end up talking late into the night. So Pitts, as I say, is fascinated by logic and mathematics and the deep sort of structures of number systems and logic. And Warren McCulloch is a neurologist and is interested in the brain. And they realize that there's an interesting synthesis here. There's a synthesis between what logic is doing and what's happening in the brain when there's an action potential, when there's this signal. And they realize that perhaps you can put these two things together and write down the mathematical model of a neuron where there are these signals coming in, which either fire or don't, and a signal coming out either fires or doesn't. So here we have Pitts and McCulloch, and in 1943 they write this book, this paper called A Logical Calculus of the Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity. And I love the way paper titles used to be given. I think this is a rather wonderful one. But essentially what they do is they come up with the first mathematical model of signals passing through neurons, and this is really the precursor, in a sense, to everything that we have today in terms of neural networks, and we'll see that in detail in a bit. But what they have here is that the neuron that they've sort of written down, created, which is called the Pitts-McCulloch neuron, is very much binary. You have a signal coming in where you have a number of signals, and you can think about them coming in from other neurons, and either they're firing or they're not. And out from the artificial neuron comes either a 0 or a 1. It fires or it doesn't. Unfortunately, this paper doesn't really make waves with, well, either the biological community or the mathematics community. And in fact, it turns out that, well, what's really going on in the neuron is somewhat more complex than that. And in fact, Letvin and McCulloch and Pitts and Maturana end up writing another paper, What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain, which goes into some of the more sort of detailed and messy aspects of neurons. So we jump forward now another few years to 1958, and this is Frank Rosenblatt on the left, and he invents what is essentially an adaptation of the Pitts-McCulloch neuron, and it's something that is called the perceptron. And essentially, the change from the Pitts-McCulloch neuron is, as I say, in the Pitts-McCulloch neuron, you either have zeros or ones coming in, and you've got 0 or 1 going out. With the perceptron, the numbers that come in, they don't just have to be 0 or 1, they can be any numbers coming in. And what's happening here with this incredible tangle of wires is an experiment that he set up where essentially he had a camera which was looking at pieces of paper, and on the pieces of paper were written things. And what this strange creation actually was able to do was to detect whether the image was on the left or the right of the piece of paper. And, this sounds very, very simple now, but in fact, at the time, this was incredibly complicated. Essentially, what there were in this camera, there were 400 photoreceptors, each one of which went through to a wire. And each one of those, the signals coming in from the wire, was multiplied by some number and added together in some particular way, which we're going to go into a little bit more detail in a bit. And all of these sums came together and you output a number, and the number, which is the response, tells you, well, it's either on the left or it's on the right. The image is on the left or the right. Okay. quote from the New York Times, which I rather like, is the embryo of an electronic computer that expects that the Navy expects will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. This was the description of the perceptron. Incidentally, this was paid for by the US Navy, this experiment. Okay, so what's going on here? What's happening with the perceptron? Let's think here of a classification task. And in essentially everything that I'm going to talk about today, we're going to be thinking about data. And data comes in many, many different forms. They may be images, they may be lists of numbers, they may be written text. They come in many different forms. But let's say we have a data set, which is some medical data set where we've got maybe 1,000 people. Well, by the looks of things, we've got on the order of 10 to 15 people here. And each person has an age, blood pressure, maybe some comorbidity, vaccination status, previous infections, and the outcome after a COVID infection. And maybe the outcome is 1 is bad and 0 is good. Okay. So this looks a little bit messy. We've got quite a few things going on here, but let's just take a simple set of this and let's plot a graph here, or an image here, just displaying the age and the blood pressure of patients. And each one of these points, the green circles or the red squares, corresponds to an individual person. And of course, this is a cartoon of what goes on. But here I've labeled them by the outcome after the COVID infection, whether it was a good outcome or a bad outcome. And the bad outcomes I've done as the red squares here, and the good outcomes I've done as the green circles. Okay. And what we see here is that there's clearly some pattern here, and I've created the pattern myself, but you can see that there's some pattern here where if somebody, if the age is high or the blood pressure is high, then it's likely that they would have had a bad outcome. And if the age was low and the blood pressure is low, then maybe they would have had a better outcome. Okay. So the question now is, can we use this data to make some prediction? So what we're going to do is we're going to put in what's called a decision boundary. And the decision boundary allows us to say, well, now we've got some new data points. This light blue data point in the bottom right with a question mark in. And based on the decision boundary, we can say, well, if this new data point is above the decision boundary, then we're going to predict that the outcome is bad. And if it's below the decision boundary, I don't know what's happened there. Am I still sharing? Am I still here?
We're still here, and we can see your screen.
Okay.
So we see Teams at the moment.
Currently in Telegram.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Okay, very good. Okay. Okay. So we've got this decision boundary, and we put this in this line here because we can see, of course, that there's this pattern in the data. But the question we want to ask is, can a machine find this? And this is really what machine learning is about. Machine learning is simply taking data, some data set, and saying, can we find a pattern in the data such that we can make predictions about new data items that we've never seen before? So this is, I think, the only place here I'm going to have any maths at all. Okay? So what we're going to do is we've got this thing in the top left, and really this is a perceptron. This is a simplified version of what Frank Rosenblatt had in his perceptron. What do we have? Well, we have age coming in, and for each patient, we've got the age coming in, we've got the blood pressure coming in. We multiply the age by some number, it's called a weight, W1, and we multiply the blood pressure by some weight, W2, and there's another term, which is the bias. The output of this is the age times W1 plus blood pressure times W2 plus the bias. That's it. Simple as that. Now, the question, of course, is what is B and W1 and W2? Okay. Well, the final output of this actually is that if the output of this sort of the blue blue rectangle here is greater than 0, then we're going to predict 1. And if it's less than 0, we're going to predict 0. Okay, that is to say, if it's greater than 0, the output of this sum here, we're going to predict that it's a bad outcome, else it's a good outcome. The point is that depending on the value of B and W1 and W2 that we choose, essentially it's going to correspond to different decision boundaries. Okay, so what we saw before is this is clearly the correct decision boundary, correct in some sense, in that everything above here really is predicted correctly and everything below it is predicted, is predicted as 1, everything below it is predicted as 0. Okay, so what we see in fact is that these numbers B and W1 and W2 actually change this line, this decision boundary. Okay, so if I take some random values of B and W1 and W2, then we get this red line here, and the error is high. So most of the time, or a lot of the time, the prediction isn't going to be right. So for instance, the green points, which we know are good outcomes, would be predicted here as bad outcomes. Okay, the green line here is the sort of optimal line, the optimal decision boundary, because the error from this is lower. And what we want to do is to say the error is going to be the number of cases which are incorrectly predicted. Okay, the number of cases here which are incorrectly predicted based on the values of the parameters B and W1 and W2. And we're going to change B and W1 and W2 until we find a decision boundary where actually everything is predicted precisely as we have in the data set. Okay. We can define this thing called an error function. The details of this actually don't matter too much. Okay, we've got some error function here in the left, and it's a function of, that is to say, it changes as you change W1 and W2. Okay, so the red line here corresponds to some high point on the error function, and the green line here corresponds to some low point on the error function. Okay, what we want to do is to change the values of W1, W2 so that we fall down this error sort of dish, this bowl, until we're right at the bottom and we have the lowest possible error, which corresponds to the green line. Okay, essentially mathematics over here. Okay. That's all it's doing. That's all the perceptron is doing. But in this case, I had just 2 variables, age and blood pressure, and I was using them to predict whether or not somebody's outcome, COVID outcome, was good or bad. Okay. The general perceptron doesn't just have 1, 2 inputs. It has any number of inputs, x1, oh, sorry, I should say x1, x2, all the way down to xn, and each one of those is multiplied by a w1, a w2, etc., to wn. And you do the same thing. The output is b plus this sum. Okay, and then you apply some particular function to the output. The difference of this, the details of this don't matter. But this is what Frank Rosenblatter did, where the inputs to his perceptron were the pixels, essentially the pixels from the photograph, and he was tuning B and W1 and W2 such that it gave the correct prediction as to whether the image was on the left or the right. Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert come along and they write this book in 1969 called Perceptrons. And up until this moment, people had thought that this, strange thing here, the perceptron, was this kind of potentially all-powerful thing that could be used to make predictions about new data in an automatic or semi-automatic way. Minsky and Papert come along and show that actually this on its own is very limited. There are certain types of things that it can't predict. They could prove that there were things that it couldn't do. Okay. Then we get something else, which is called the multi-layer perceptron, which essentially says, well, let's not just have one of these things where we've got some inputs coming in and then the output label, but let's put a load of them together into a particular way. And this really is the first proper neural network. It's called the multi-layer perceptron. There are lots of weights here and lots of parameters to tune. But the beautiful thing here is that we're able, what we had in this case was that we had a straight line decision boundary. Okay, and it turns out that that's all you can do with the perceptron on its own. You can just have a straight line decision boundary. Okay, you change the values of W1, W2, and B, and it changes the position of this decision boundary. And you find the values that give the best predictions, and that then allows you to make new predictions. But if you have a data set that looks like this, where there isn't a straight line decision boundary, but maybe there's a circular decision boundary, the perceptron on its own is not able to do this, but the multi-layer perceptron with some special functions added in, are able to do this, what are called deal with non-linear decision boundaries. Okay, and this again, this is a classification problem. So I'm sure you've seen these ideas, maybe not, of sort of classifying pictures, of categorizing pictures. Now this seems a bit weird. So what does it mean? What's actually going on here? In essence, it's nothing different from the multi-layer perceptron that we just looked at. Okay, but what you have to do is to take an image, let's say an image of a cat here on the top left, and you translate the pixel values into a series of numbers. Okay, that series of numbers lives at a point in the same way that here we have each person here corresponds to a single point in this figure, where a given person has an age and they've got a blood pressure, and so they sit in this two-dimensional space. Okay, the pixel values for a cat, maybe they live in a 1 million dimensional space, and I've just drawn it here as three-dimensional. Okay, but you can imagine, or it's kind of difficult to imagine, but you can sort of extrapolate that the image of the cat is a single point in a very, very high dimensional space. And again, this is just a cartoon, but you can imagine that each of these pictures of cats on the left and each of the pictures of dogs on the right correspond to some point in this very, very high dimensional space. Okay. What the modern machine learning techniques are doing is finding a plane that slices through this space such that everything on the left of the plane would be predicted to be a cat and everything on the right of the plane would be predicted to be a dog. Okay, and essentially that's all this is doing. It's finding the correct hyperplane in this million-dimensional space and finding the parameters which correctly predict what's happening for each of the training data that you have, such that when you want to test it on some new data that you've never seen before, maybe a completely new picture of a dog or a cat, that you just say, is it on the left of this plane or is it on the right? Okay, if it's on the left, you just predict it's a cat. If it's on the right, you predict it's a dog. And maybe it doesn't do so well. Okay, maybe you put in an image of a cat and the output, it says dog. So when that happens, what you need to do is to what's called back propagate. Sounds like a complex term, but essentially you're just taking that error and saying, how would I need to change the values of W1, W2, and actually all the millions of W's in here and the biases, such that actually the output is now cat. And you can think that this is taking that plane and all of a sudden this cat is on the wrong side of it. So I just need to move the plane just a little bit so that the cat is now correctly identified as a cat. And in doing that, we're just tuning the parameters of what's called a deep neural network. Okay, a deep neural network, in essence, is a series of these perceptrons, maybe added together in complex ways, but just put together like this. Okay, all you need in order to do this, in order to make predictions about images of cats and dogs, let's say, is just lots of data, lots of images of cats and dogs. Okay. So one can do the same thing with faces. So here on the left, we have a load of faces. But what's actually happening in the layers, each of these is called a layer of a neural network. And these are the hidden layers. Essentially, what's happening here is that in the middle, it's learning to detect different kinds of features, and in particular, features at different scales, of different complexity. So the first hidden layer here, when the network is trained, once you've trained it on lots and lots and lots of data, it's able to detect straight lines, little curves, shadow and light contrasts. The next layer is able to say, okay, well, I can put together these different features and I can suddenly pick up noses and eyes and ears. And the next layer is able to pick up more complex structures again, combinations of these which are faces. And by training the neural network to train all these weights and biases, what you're doing is you're allowing the network then to be able to make predictions about new faces that it's never seen before. Okay. Are there any questions at the moment? I'm going to sort of go through a quick sort of list of some of the advancements from then before we get onto the stuff about the really modern areas. Are there any questions that people have about what we've looked at so far?
There's nothing so far in the chat, but I will
Okay.
give them a moment.
Okay, sure. So we can come back to questions if there are any. So what's happened between 1958 with the perceptron and 1969 with Minsky and Pappert's book on perceptrons? Well, actually, so we've got the original perceptron here. We've got the book by Minsky and Papert, and really this was kind of the start of what's called the first AI winter. And the first AI winter essentially said that all of the hype that had happened in the 1950s and early 1960s about the potential power of artificial intelligence, maybe it wasn't quite as good as we'd hoped. And in particular, Minsky and Pappert's book was really one of the kind of the things that set this off to say, yeah, actually, maybe this whole idea of a neural network, actually, it can't do what we'd hoped it would do. On the right here is a cartoon of John Searle's famous Chinese room, where essentially the idea here is that you've got somebody with simply a book of rules of what happens if you see a series of Chinese characters. You just look up in the book what the response should be, and you output the response. Okay, and the idea here is that this is, in some sense, a cartoon of what's happening in a neural network, in an artificial neural network, that there's some inputs and there's some set of rules and there's some outputs. And clearly the person in here sitting in the Chinese room with the rule ledger, who takes an input, figures out what the correct output should be and gives the output, they don't understand anything. They don't know Chinese. They don't actually have an understanding of what's going on, but the input and output are completely reasonable so long as the rule ledger is correct. But the idea here was that, well, you can't possibly have real, artificial intelligence if it's simply a set of rules, and essentially the mathematics of the neural network, you can think about it as a very, very complex set of rules. A couple of other reports came out, Language and Machines, Computers in Translation and Linguistics, that also spoke about the limitations of these sorts of neural networks. And this paper, the so-called Lighthill report, came out in 1972, Artificial Intelligence, a General Survey, where it was stated in no part of the field have the discoveries made so far produced the major impact that was then promised. So, this was the first AI winter, and actually this went on for quite some time. It was actually until well after 1972. But a lot of the funding stopped at this point. 1972, Shinichi Omari came up with this idea of what's called a recurrent neural network. So what we've been looking at up to now is, for instance, an image comes in, it goes through this complicated neural network and outputs cat or dog or whatever the prediction is, good outcome for COVID, bad outcome for COVID. What a recurrent neural network does is it does something very, very similar, but there's some sort of history going on. So what happens, a signal comes in, it goes through the first layer, but it then comes back and then goes back into the first layer. And in some sense, there's a memory here. There's a memory that keeps going in this recurrent way that includes all of the past information that's been fed into the neural network and adds onto it. And what this allows you to do is to put in sequences of data, for instance, language. Language is a sequence of words in a well-defined order. So when I say the words, for instance, such a bad movie, it's really important that by the time I get to movie, you still remember the words that came before then. That's pretty vital. And in this case, you might want to be doing what's called sentiment analysis, which says you put in such, then a, then bad, then movie, through the neural network, and it has this memory of what came before. And what the output that you want is that this is a negative movie review, for instance. And again, you train it on lots and lots of data where it's been labeled that such a bad movie review corresponds to negative, and such a great movie review, such a great movie corresponds to something positive. Okay, or you can use this for machine translation. So, how are you? Gets translated into Italian, come va? And exactly the same thing is happening. But remember, we need to train this on lots and lots and lots of past data. Okay, this is vital. This is really what's happened over the last few years. Is the computational power of what we have now is able to process much more larger quantities of data than we were able to process before. And so we can take all of the world's literature, all of the world's former translations, for instance, and pass it through this recurrent neural network. Actually, that's not what we do now, but you could pass it through a recurrent neural network, train these weights and biases, just move them around bit by bit in a very particular way, such that the output is the output which is there in your training data. That is to say, you've got a training data which says, how are you, come va? And you make sure that it outputs the correct output by changing these weights and biases. 1986, the so-called backpropagation algorithm was really sort of popularized. And essentially what this allows us to do, I'm going to go back a little bit here, is the error here when this neural network predicted dog, you would like to be able to work out what change you need to make to all of the weights and biases in the network, which you can think of in the brain as being the strengths of the synapses, how strongly one synapse connects to another. Okay, in a positive or a negative way. You want to work out what's the way that you need to update them such that if you pass this image through again, it would give you cat. Okay, and the way this is done these days is by something called backpropagation by gradient descent. The gradient descent doesn't matter, but backpropagation basically means you take that error, the thing that was wrong, and you just pass it back bit by bit through the network, and it allows you to just sort of tune up those weights and biases such that the prediction in the future will be more accurate. And by feeding more and more data, training data, you're able to tweak all of the weights and biases so that when you give it a new picture of a cat, it's going to accurately give you that picture of a cat. Okay. So great. So the recurrent neural network comes along and is able to train not just on images, but now on sequences. Sequences being, things like language. It may be, for instance, EEG signals. It could be stock market prices, anything like this. Now we've got backpropagation, which allows us to much more efficiently train these neural networks. Then Schmidhuber comes along and develops this idea called a convolutional neural network. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but essentially it's able to analyze images in much more accurate ways than could be done with the simple multi-layer perceptron. And there are clear analogs with what's happening in the in the receptor fields in the eye. And this has sort of happened throughout. There's been this wonderful synergy between biology and artificial intelligence that we've often used ideas from biology, from neuroscience, to give us new insights into what we can do with artificial intelligence in order to improve these systems. Okay, and the convolutional neural network came along and was able to do these sort of image tasks much more accurately than could be done before. Then we have the second AI winter, when, again, a lot of funding was pulled. And essentially, although these theoretical techniques had come along, the computer power that we had at the time simply wasn't enough to be able to utilize them to do anything particularly interesting or useful. At the same time, these ideas that there's something called an expert system, which essentially is very much rule-based rather than having a neural network which learns from data. In an expert system, you code in precisely the rules, and the rule might be, if you see a whisker here, then the likelihood of it being a cat is 80%. If you see paws, which are like this, maybe it's going to be a dog. So an expert system is essentially a set of rules which have been hand-coded. There was a problem with the recurrent neural networks that I spoke about before, which was that This is great if you have a very short sentence, such a bad movie. But if you have a very, very long sentence, then it turns out that you have to remember an enormous amount about what happened before. And of course, it's really difficult to know what it is that you're going to need later on. The LSTM, also called the long short-term memory neural network, was developed, which allowed the network to forget. And this is really important because maybe you have a sentence like this, such a bad movie. Maybe the words such and a are much less important than the words bad movie. And so with an LSTM, you're able to forget things as you go along, and maybe it's able to choose what to forget such that the stuff which is really important can be remembered. Some more modern results. So the state of the art in the 2010s was that we could take image data sets of incredibly sort of diverse types of pictures. So we got here pictures which are categorized into vehicles, crafts, watercraft, sailing vessels, sailboats, trimarans, and in the top we've got Siberian husky. Okay, lots and lots of images, and rather than just predicting whether something's a cat or a dog, predicting precisely the class that something is in and the classes that it belongs to. So a neural network which can predict whether something is a Siberian husky or some other type of husky, a trimaran versus a catamaran, whatever it may be. And by the 2010s, actually no, around 2015 or so, we're at the point that these systems can categorize images better than most humans. And by a little bit later, by around 2019 or so, it was at the point, 2015, it could actually get to the point that it could do better than even humans who have been trained precisely on these sorts of images. Okay. In the 2010s, machine translation was still pretty bad. Humans had beaten AI in Jeopardy. A famous experiment was done where, rather than in the case where I said you've got loads of pictures of cats and dogs and it's able to predict a cat and a dog, but in that case I labeled them first. So I said these are cats and these are dogs, learn them. Google was able to train a system which just looked at videos on YouTube and realized for itself that there was a thing, didn't know that it was called a cat, but it sort of created this cluster of things that it recognized were similar. And in fact, those were clusters of cats. So it could recognize that there was a sort of entity there, a thing there, which even if it didn't know the label of it, it was able to see that there were similarities within this class of things and this class of things. Okay. Just a quick AI ontology here. So, you know, I'm sure you would have heard the word artificial intelligence and machine learning, but often they're used very interchangeably. Importantly, machine learning is the machine, the computer, using data to find patterns. Okay, so that's exactly what we had with the COVID prediction idea there, with the age and the blood pressure. We've got a data set, and the machine is able to tune the parameters itself using the so-called backpropagation to make accurate predictions in the future. So machine learning necessarily utilizes data in order to make future predictions. Artificial intelligence, which does include machine learning, also includes aspects which are not machine learning, which are things like these expert systems where it's hand-coded rules. Okay. Also aspects of formal logic fit within AI, but are not machine learning. Within machine learning, there are really three kind of separate categories, although there are actually overlaps between them. There's supervised learning, where I give you some data and the data is labeled. It's labeled, for instance, this person had a good COVID outcome, this person had a bad COVID outcome. Or in the case of this galaxy zoo, this image is of a barred spiral galaxy. This image is of an elliptical galaxy, whatever it may be. And you're asking the computer to find patterns within this data. There's unsupervised learning, where you don't give it any labels at all, but you just say, I want you to find clusters of data here. And in the bottom right here, on the right, we've got this data where there's some blue data, green data, red data. But if I gave you this set of data, you know, maybe it's blood pressure and blood pressure and age, it might just notice that there are 3 separate clusters there. And that's the idea of unsupervised learning. And then there's reinforcement learning, which I'm going to talk about next week. Deep learning is utilizing deep neural networks, which are just neural networks like the multi-layer perceptron with multiple hidden layers in the middle between going from the input to the output, the application of those to supervised learning, unsupervised learning, or reinforcement learning. Okay. So what's happened since then? Okay, so a few ideas have become particularly important, and very, very importantly, computer power has massively increased. And it's increased to the point that all of the ideas that came along pre-2020 or even pre-2015 are now being utilized in ways that they couldn't be utilized before, simply because we didn't have the computational power to do so, along with some theoretical improvements. So the types of things people have been looking at over the last few years are different methods by which we can use machine learning, AI, to tackle climate change, be that through sociological ways, through technological ways, through carbon capture, many different ways. There was a machine learning study looking at taking the voices of people and detecting whether there's the early signs of Parkinson's disease just by looking at the signal in the voice and making a predictive algorithm using machine learning to make that prediction as to whether somebody did or did not have Parkinson's. Machine learning in cancer imaging, so taking images, they may be MRI images, they may be X-rays, and coming up with systems which in many cases these days are better than radiologists, and making predictions as to whether something is or is not cancer, is malignant, what type of cancer it is, all of these sorts of things. Okay. So a few years ago, an idea came along which actually had been sort of developed a little while before, but this idea of a generative adversarial network. Does anybody know who the 3 people at the top here are? Emma, is there any input from anybody as to whether anyone knows who these people are?
Nothing so far in the chat. No, nobody seems to be typing. I don't recognise them. Oh, somebody's put AI produced or fake.
Indeed, yes.
Generated.
So these people do not exist. Okay, these are images of people who do not exist, and they've been generated by an AI system in a brilliant. I think this idea of a generative adversarial network, which is what this is called, which creates this, is really mind-blowing the way that it works. And I can describe briefly what's happening. You get a large pile of images of pictures of people's faces. You have one network, one neural network. It's really very similar to what we saw before, but it outputs, rather than inputting images, it outputs images. And to start with, it outputs just random noise. It's never seen a picture of a person before. It just outputs random images. You've got another neural network, which is taking sometimes those images and sometimes real images from the pile of pictures that we have. And its job is to detect whether or not something is a real face or not a real face. Of course, at the beginning, both of these networks, the one which is producing, generating images, and the one which is detecting, they're both terrible at their jobs. This one has no idea what it means to produce a picture of a face. It's never seen a picture of a face. And the other one, well, it doesn't know what's supposed to be in a face. However, the one which is the detector, the one which is saying, yes, I think this is a face or not, gets some feedback. It's told whether it did a good job or not. And if it did a good job, well, it keeps doing what it does. And if it's done a bad job, then it changes its weights a little bit so that in the future, it will be able to do a better job at detecting whether something was a real image of a face or one of the fake ones coming from the generator. At the same time, the generator gets a signal as to whether it was able to trick the detector. So you've got 2 networks here, and they're working in an adversarial fashion. And what happens over time is that the detector gets better and better at realizing what's a real face and what's a computer-generated face. At the same time, the generator gets better and better at tricking the detector. And if you tune this just right, then they're able to train in parallel such that the generator is able to generate more and more realistic pictures of faces, which are able to trick the predictor or the detector, which is trying its best to keep up with it. Okay? This is called a generative adversarial network, and it's been used in many different ways, not just for producing pictures of faces, but actually producing synthetic data, which itself can be used for machine learning. Here we've got something called style GAN. So generative adversarial network is called a GAN, G-A-N, and you can not only just produce pictures of people, for instance, but you can do what's called a transfer. You can take a photo and you can generate an image from that photo, which is in a particular style, be it in the style of Van Gogh, or any other artist that it's been trained on. In a similar vein, in terms of generative AI, in the last just couple of years, the likes of DALL-E 2 and Midjourney have come along, and they are able to produce art based on text prompts. So, for instance, the bottom left here, you type in elegant giraffe, high fashion, poster-like, monochromatic grey, and it's able to produce an image, which is this image here of a giraffe. Okay. This is produced entirely by an AI, which has been trained on millions and millions of images, and it's able to synthesize this actually using something called a diffusion model. The top right image here was rather controversial because this was by Jason Allen. It won a digital art competition, but it was produced by this diffusion model called DALL-E 2. So there was a lot of controversy about this because now if DALL-E 2 is winning digital art competitions, where does this leave sort of digital artists who are working at the moment? The middle image here, again, is completely computer generated by a text prompt about a teddy bear skateboarding in the middle of Times Square. Okay. Now we get on to ChatGPT. So in the bottom left here, this is actually a prompt that I put in earlier. Please write me a poem about how beautiful Oxford is. You'll see that working as we go along. ChatGPT, which is a machine learning model, generative model, which came out within the last year, ChatGPT, and now GPT-4, really came about from a paper written in 2017 called Attention is All You Need. All this is doing is predicting what is the most likely next word in a sequence. Just in the same way that we saw earlier that we had something that could sort of analyze sequences, this is a bad movie. What this is doing is saying, if I give it this is a bad movie, it's predicting what's the next most likely word in the sequence. And maybe the word would be that, this is a bad movie, that, this is a bad movie, which, this is a bad movie, full stop. Okay. That's all ChatGPT is doing. The important point here is that it is trained on an enormous amount of data, 570 gigabytes of text data. That's data in the form of codes, data in the form of scientific papers, data in the form of poems, all sorts of things. And what we see here is that it's writing a poem here for me in the style of a pirate about an AI researcher who lived outside of Oxford for 20 years, but wants to remember the beauty of Oxford. I just did this earlier. And anybody can go to ChatGPT. It's a website of OpenAI. And it's working in a very different way from the recurrent neural network that we looked at earlier in the LSTM. It's using an idea of attention, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but it's really taking us to an incredible place where this AI system is able to pass exams in an enormous range of subjects, which puts education now in a very strange place. Right? How do we test other people's abilities to pass exams when there's simply a computer there that can essentially do the exam for you? And it can do so in a massive sort of array of different subjects. And one of the incredible things about this is the rate at which it's improving. So GPT 3.5, which ChatGPT was based on, came out under a year ago, and GPT-4 came out just a couple of months ago, and GPT-4 is already vastly superior, vastly more powerful than GPT 3.5. I use this pretty much every day within my research, be it to, I'll put in a piece of text that I want to improve. I'll put in some code that I wanted to write, and it'll write the code for me. I'll ask it, how to put together two different ideas. It's incredibly powerful, but there's also a lot that we don't know about it. I see that I'm running very quickly out of time, but essentially what it's doing is the beautiful thing here is that it looks at the attention, the relationship between different words, and that's the key to this. Clearly, I don't have time to go into it in detail now. Where do we go from here? I'm going to actually come off full screen for the moment. Where do we go from here? Well, these are the great questions at the moment. We don't know yet whether this is an existential risk, either from bad actors using it and doing so to create misinformation, an existential risk from the point of view of creating artificial generalized intelligence, which has its own desires and tries to take over the world. We don't know whether this is overblown hype, and actually the trajectory that we see at the moment is going to level off very quickly, and maybe it's reached the capabilities that it will possibly reach. Is it just a handy tool that that we can all use, to write fun poems, maybe to do a bit of coding? Is it the solution to all our problems? Is it able to find that connection between biochemistry and material science and whatever other subject, and bring them together to create carbon capture materials that we can use to fight climate change? We're finding that there are these so-called emergent capabilities of it, which can actually do scientific research for us. There was this amazing paper essentially doing chemistry, creating a whole lab setup of exactly what experiments to do and how to analyze it. And we've seen over the last couple of months sparks of what are called artificial general intelligence, which are the early experiments with GPT-4. And I think I'm going to have to stop at this point. I know it's been a bit of a whirlwind, but I will stop there and see if there are any questions. I'm sorry for the rush.
Thank you for that. That's brilliant. There are now a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
If you stop screen sharing, it may be easiest just to then be able to have a look at them.
There we go. Chat. Yes. Let me see. Okay. Oh gosh, there's lots of questions here. There are lots of copywriters and journalists who are concerned by the impact of ChatGPT and already seeing the effects on company choosing. Yeah, absolutely. So IBM have stopped their hires within certain areas. There are call centers who are using ChatGPT essentially. So there are existential risks also in terms of the labor market. We don't know yet the impact that this is going to have. It's both an exciting and a kind of terrifying time because we don't know what the future holds. And I find myself, as somebody who works within AI, although I can think of some of the possibilities, what I find week by week is that something new comes along which I wasn't expecting. Okay, something new comes along which I didn't think it would be able to do, and so we're at a time now where it's very, very difficult to predict what may happen in the coming months or years. So yeah, no, absolutely. There are major concerns with this. There are major concerns about the biases inherent in the data that it's been trained on. So yeah, no, absolutely. Major question marks and risks. Jonathan mentioned in passing earlier that modern machine translation no longer works on recurrent neural network principles. Good. So Google Translate. So things like Google Translate are actually working on. They use as part of them things like so the paper called "Attention is All You Need" gave us something called a transformer architecture, and many of these translation tools are using transformer architectures to do their translations. And Google Translate is in many ways better than ChatGPT, precisely because it's been created as a specific translation piece of software. But they're not using recurrent neural networks in the same way. So there isn't the same recurrence as there is in a so transformers don't have the same sort of recurrence that recurrent neural networks did. Essentially, it takes all of the data in one go, the whole sequence in one go. It finds the relationships between all of the words, and then utilizes that relationship to make predictions about the next word in a sequence. So yeah, so most of the modern translation tools are not using these precisely because things like transformers don't have the same issues about long-term dependencies of this word may be related to a word which is, a long time ago in the text. Yep. Does that answer the question?
Hopefully it does.
Okay, very good.
John, that is
yes.
Yeah,
He says yes.
That's been terrific. We are very close to our deadline. Yes, thank you, John. Thank you very much indeed for all of that. I won't pester you with the questions that ChatGPT suggested, so you'll have to guess what those might have been. But it's been great to hear from you. And who knew that the history goes back over 100 years? That's I didn't expect that to happen. So very helpful to give us that sort of context and sense of the kind of the big picture. So many of us will be back here about this time next week to hear part 2. So I know some of our colleagues will have other commitments and will need to zoom away. So if you have got other things, people who need to slip away now, quite understand. Thank you very much for being with us, guys. But I feel that we should give you a sort of virtual round of applause. So either on your chat or real. Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan Schock.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks. And I see you all next week, I hope. Many of you. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody. Great to see you guys today.